Whisper is a horror novel by Taiwanese author Chang. It's published by Honford Star, and it's translated by Roddy Flag, a translator who I have never come across before. Whisper is one of my favourite books in translation of 2021. Absolutely, full stop. Now, I'm a big fan of horror. I love horror novels, horror short stories, horror movies, etc. I also love books from Taiwan, and I love Taiwan in particular. It's one of my favourite countries. Are you gonna be a problem? No, you're never a problem. So, Chang in Whisper has created one of the finest horror novels that I've ever read. I am always hungry for new horror stories, horror novels, horror authors, because we don't need more Stephen King novels. But it's hard to find them. It's hard to find books that genuinely terrify you, make your skin crawl, and make you feel uneasy. And Whisper absolutely delivers on that. Whisper is a folk horror story set in the modern day that really feels reminiscent of old, creeping, horrible Japanese ghost stories. The original Grudge and The Ring. Snowy. These old Japanese horror stories, they really feel like they have their claws in this, which is actually thematically appropriate because this isn't just a horror story. Whisper is also a novel that explores the relationship historically between Taiwan and Japan, as well as the relationship between the Taiwanese people and the native people of Taiwan. Before I talk about what it's actually about, I need to give huge thanks to two people. One is the translator, Roddy Flag. Roddy Flag has done such an exceptional bit of work here with Whisper. Snowy, do you mind? No, she doesn't mind. Roddy Flag has blown me away with his translation here. I've never come across him before. He's an incredible translator. I really have to praise the way that he's handled the tone of this book. There are moments of gruesome body horror. There are also a few moments of kind of relieving comedy, and he handles it all so deftly as a translator. He really is fantastic. And the other person or people that I need to say thank you to are Honford Star themselves for publishing this. Honford Star have blown up over the last few years as an incredible publisher of literature from Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. Those are kind of the main three. And they've done such a good job time and time again, especially this year. Whisper is such a good book. It is one of my favorite books of 2021, and I haven't even talked about what it's about yet. Sorry. Okay, so what's it about? Whisper is a Taiwanese horror novel. It tells the story of a horrible, nasty taxi driver. He's this drunk, gambling, philandering guy. He's about 50 years old. He and his wife have a terrible marriage. They are separated from their daughter, who kind of just left. You never see this daughter. She just left one day. She'd had enough of her parents and she fucked off. And she left these two rubbish parents alone to deal with themselves and each other. At the beginning of the novel, in chapter 1, we get our taxi driver's perspective as well as his wife's. The taxi driver himself is called Wu Shisheng, and I guess he's the protagonist, really. His wife also gets a perspective in chapter 1, and then she dies. That's in the blurb, so I don't really consider it a spoiler. She is killed by a ghost, and this ghost has started to haunt Shisheng and his wife together. I honestly don't remember how Shisheng's wife meets the ghost or comes across her at first, because so much happens in this book. When I finished it, I couldn't remember how the journey began. It's not that long, and it just goes. It takes you on such an incredible journey, geographically from place to place, but also thematically and emotionally. You follow these characters on this incredible journey. So when I got to the end, I couldn't even remember how it all began. I remember that Shisheng, the taxi driver, he comes across this voice. He and his taxi driver buddies are all parked along the roadside, and they're gambling and playing cards, but there's this one taxi that is abandoned, and he kind of breaks into this taxi, and the driver vanished at some point, but he left this tape recorder behind, and on the tape recorder is the voice of this person, this child, that seems to be singing and whispering and speaking Japanese, and Shisheng has no idea what this is, but his wife is also being haunted by this same voice. She ends up accidentally hurting someone while she's at work, that person ends up in hospital, and then Shisheng's wife also at some point while she's at home tries to crawl through this little space on her balcony that no human can fit through, and there's bits of blood and flesh left where she was trying to obviously escape from something. She ends up in a psych ward, and while she's on that psych ward, she is being haunted by this ghost, and then suddenly the doctors and nurses walk in and find her body with its head twisted all the way around. She's been killed by this ghost, but no one can prove that or accept that, and so it's marked as suicide. Somehow she managed to twist her entire head around, and they call it suffocation, but it obviously isn't. Xi Sheng is now a widower, and he is also being haunted by this ghost, and so the story really picks up from there as he tries to figure out who this ghost is, what it wants, why it's killed his wife, etc. And this is where we really start to dig into Japanese imperialism and the relationship between the Taiwanese and the native people of the island of Taiwan. And it becomes political to a point, but it's really used as a kind of background echo that feeds into everything as it goes. The relationship between Taiwan and Japan historically is fascinating. Japan occupied Taiwan for 50 years up until the end of World War II when the Japanese Empire fell. And that means that Japan's mark has been left on the island of Taiwan for 100 years. And their relationship is fascinating, and the history of the Japanese occupation of Taiwan really feeds into the plot and narrative of this book. Partly because our characters are connected to it somehow. Xi Sheng's father lived in Japan for a while, he took a Japanese name for a while, his father was from Manchuria, which was also Japan occupied, so you've got this family connection. But also the ghost is speaking Japanese, and probably died maybe during the occupation, so there must be some reason surrounding the occupation for her being a ghost and doing what she's doing, right? I guess, maybe? We'll see. And also, why Xi Sheng? And from the moment that his wife dies, we're then moving into other characters' perspectives. And there are other protagonists that get introduced. One of them is Xi Sheng's sister-in-law, who at first we meet at the funeral, and she introduces herself as this rich dickhead. Her husband is probably cheating on her. She has a Birkin bag that indicates how rich she is, and she ends up following her husband to Beijing on a business trip to try to find out if he's actually cheating on her while he's in mainland China. This story at first seems to have nothing to do with the main narrative of Xi Sheng hunting down this ghost that obviously killed his wife and is haunting him as well. But again, Xi Sheng's sister-in-law's story is supernatural. It becomes frightening, it becomes monstrous as it goes, almost as a kind of short story or side narrative that's woven into the main narrative. And then we also get this doctor who treated Xi Sheng's wife. She wants to get to the bottom of it as well, so she goes on her own adventure. She's trying to hunt down this ghost. She's trying to figure it out. Her husband speaks Japanese. He ends up reading notes and sending letters and using his knowledge to get to the bottom of it as well. So these characters are building and building and building. Their threads are interweaving together, and the haunting is at the heart of it. In terms of how frightening the book is, it uses both horror and terror. Like, if you define horror as things like blood and gore and chopped off limbs and jump scares and in-your-face frightening moments, the book has all of that. It uses creepy things and bugs and gunge and disease and body horror and blood. It uses all of these things very sparingly, occasionally. The death of Xi Sheng's wife is kind of the first moment where she died in a really horrible way that you can very viscerally picture. And then towards the end, as a climax is building, you're getting more and more of it. But then there's also terror, creeping dread, a sense of unease, a sense of claustrophobia, a sense of being lost and turned around like you're in a labyrinth. All of these more unsettling and creeping and spine-chilling elements are in there too. So this is horror and terror mixed and blended together masterfully. The book is chilling all the way through. And it also not gave me nightmares, but caused nightmares to happen. After I finished reading Whisper, I had a few nights of nightmares. My nightmares were my own invention. They had nothing to do with what happens in the book. I was having nightmares that my brain had conjured up. But I think the reason I was having nightmares at all is because of the state of mind that this book had put me in. So if that is a selling point, I'm not sure. It might be a reason to not read it. It depends on what kind of a reader you are. But this book definitely was the reason that I was having nightmares for a few nights. And that's pretty intense. So take that as you will, but Honford Star, Roddy Flag together have brought us an incredible Taiwanese novel from an incredible Taiwanese author. I had not come across Chang before. I am very excited to read more of his stuff. As far as I know, he's kind of a young rising star, and this book is really incredible. I have so much faith in Honford Star. Every single book that they publish is a winner. This year they put out 2 incredible Korean novels, Cursed Bunny and Tower. Actually, Cursed Bunny is a short story collection, but you get me. And this as well. So you've got wonderful translation, a wonderful publisher, fantastic cover design, a brilliant Taiwanese author delivering a really spine-chilling, gruesome, nasty, gross at times Taiwanese horror story. It has all of the ghostly elements that you expect from kind of Japanese horror novels and horror movies, but it's Taiwanese, which means you're also getting a lot of traditional Chinese folk elements. There are traditional Chinese ghosts in here. The ghost herself is repeatedly called by a name that is hundreds of years old, this Chinese folk tradition of ghosts and mystical creatures, but then also Shinto factors into it. There are references to Shintoism because we learn more later on about shrines on mountains and how they factor into the ghost herself. I can't give any of it away, but it's amazing the blending and blurring of Chinese mythology and Japanese tradition and folklore and mysticism and etc, etc, etc. There's so much blending of these cultures together, and it also is examining Japanese imperialism and the relationship between Taiwan and the native people of the island. It goes on and on and on. This book covers so much ground, and in the end, after all of it, after all the revelations at the end, everything is tied up in a neat bow, and you get really detailed and considered explanations and backstories and everything. It's very satisfying. I won't tell you about the ending, but I will tell you that it's a satisfying one. And up until that point, you will be chilled and frightened and broken into little pieces. This is one of my favorite books of 2021. Whisper is a fantastic Taiwanese novel, and I might now call it my favorite Taiwanese novel that I've read so far. High praise, but I mean it. Subscribe for books.